and welcome to the Fall 2020 Rohm and Haas Fellow in Focus lecture presented by the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Center for the History of Chemistry at the Science History Institute. I'm Charlotte Abney Solomon, Associate Director of the Beckman Center, and it's my honor this evening to welcome you all and to introduce our speaker, Professor Frank James of University College London. We're very glad you've all joined us this evening for our fall lecture. The Rohm and Haas Fellow in Focus lecture series gives us the opportunity each spring and fall to invite some of our outstanding fellows to a forum to present their work to a broad audience interested in history, science, and culture. The Science History Institute is home to the largest private fellowship program in the historical study of science, medicine, and technology in the United States, with around 20 scholars in residence each year. We offer short-term, dissertation, and postdoctoral fellowships on an annual cycle for scholars whose research benefits from the use of our collections. And we welcome researchers from all over the world each year to take part in our vibrant scholarly community. For more information on our fellowship program, we invite you to visit us at sciencehistory.org/fellowships. Before we begin with tonight's lecture, I'll say a bit about the format of this evening's program. Professor James will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we'll have 10 minutes for audience Q&A. You can send in your questions during the talk using the chat function here on YouTube. You'll just need to log in to post your question, and we will collect the questions from the chat for the Q&A. Now I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. Frank James is a professor of the history of science at University College London, and he worked previously at the Royal Institution. His research concentrates on the physical sciences in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and how they relate to other areas of society and culture, such as art, literature, business, media, religion, technology, and the military. He edited The Correspondence of Michael Faraday, which was published in 6 volumes between 1991 and 2012, as well as a number of essay collections, including The Common Purposes of Life, a set of papers on the Royal Institution. His book, Michael Faraday, A Very Short Introduction, was published in 2010 by Oxford University Press, which the following year published his sesquicentenary edition of Faraday's Chemical History of a Candle. Professor James's current research is on the practical work of Humphrey Davy, including Davy's work on nitrous oxide, agricultural chemistry, mineralogy, the miner's safety lamp, analysis of ancient Roman pigments, and Davy's attempts to chemically unroll the papyri excavated from Herculaneum. So with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Frank James.
Well, thank you, Charlotte, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to talk about Humphrey Davy, whom you can see on the right here, this magnificent portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence. Here you have effectively the president of the Royal Académie, Lawrence, painting the president of the Royal Society of London, this sort of premier position in British science in the early 1820s. Davy was born in Penzance in the house circled in red in the left-hand image. Penzance is in the far west of England. You can't get much further in England before you fall into the Atlantic Ocean. And this map shows the places that matter to Davy: Ludgvan, St Michael's Mount, and Truro up on the top right. Davy's father was a yeoman farmer, farmed about 60 or so acres at Ludgvan, and this is a tithe map where I've indicated in purple ink, don't quite know why I use purple ink, but indicated in purple ink the fields that the family farmed. He was also a bit of a builder and built the farmhouse where young Humphrey spent his younger years at any rate. And that building still survives, as you can see from this image. And it's now part of the National Dahlia Centre in England. Opposite, behind where I was photographing this, you have a view of Mounts Bay with St Michael's Mount shown here. St Michael's Mount was very, very important for Davy's poetic imagination, right from his teenage years till really towards the end of his life, Davy would write poetry, and St. Michael's Mount, as a sort of rather mystical, legendary place, would occur. So this is a very early poem by Davy, which appeared in the annual anthology. So one few poems of Davy that were published. The sober eve with purple bright sheds o'er the hills her tranquil light. In many a lingering ray, the radiance trembles on the deep, where rises rough thy rugged steep, old Michael from the sea. And on the basis of this kind of poetry, which there are probably about 150 poems that Davy wrote during his lifetime, people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Southey, and to a certain extent William Wordsworth had a very, very high opinion of Davy's poetical ability. Coleridge said if Davy hadn't been the first chemist of the day, he'd have been the first poet of the day, which I do think is a trifle generous, but there we are. As a teenager, Davy attended Truro Grammar School for a year or so, where he learnt the rudiments of Greek and Latin, and later in life, he liked nothing else but to drop the odd Latin or Greek phrase into his writings. There were problems, however, and the reason why he only spent a year at Truro Grammar School was because his father died bankrupt. He had made some unwise investments in copper and tin mines. I don't know if in the United States poldark means anything, but if poldark does mean something, people like his father, Davy's father, formed the factual basis for those kind of stories. And there's a plaque in Dodgeron Church showing, commemorating actually his parents. So as you can see, Davy's name appears quite prominently. And curiously enough, it has the wrong year of death for his father. I suppose once you've sort of carved a date, you can't really do much about it. His mother was left with 5 children, left a widow with 5 children under the age of 16. And so she returned to Penzance and very, very quickly apprenticed Davy as an apothecary. And this is the indenture of apprenticeship for Davy, agreeing to serve as an apothecary to John Penzance, as an apprentice to John Borlase. This is the only indenture where I've actually found both sides, both Borlase's side and Davy's side. And the reason why apprentice indentures are called indentures is because you can see at the top they've cut it, so there's always going to be a precise match. Now, Davy could quite easily have remained in provincial obscurity in Cornwall, apart from the fact that in the winter of 1797-8, staying for the sake of the health in Penzance was Gregory Watt on the left and Tom Wedgwood on the right, the sons of the sort of great Midlands industrialists, James Watt and Josiah Wedgwood. Normally, people of that sort of wealth, suffering from illness, and they were both very ill and would both be dead within 8 years of this period, would have gone to Italy, but Italy was closed because of the war against France, and so their doctors recommended Penzance because of the mildness of the climate. Though I have to say, having read Gregory Watt's diary, it appears to rain most of the time when the Atlantic Ocean is next door. And it's these two men, a bit older than Davy, not much older than Davy, a bit older than Davy, who turned Davy's attention to chemistry for the first time. Up until that point, Davy just seems to have written poetry and done what was necessary to practice as an apothecary. The other key figure in moving Davy's trajectory from obscurity in Penzance to fame in London, ultimately, was Davis Giddy, a minor member of the West Cornwall gentry who lived at Tredear, and he got to know Davy through Watt and Wedgwood and gave Davy the run of his library, which would be a lot more useful to know if we actually had a catalogue of what books Giddy had. Davy took his new interest very seriously, and in June of 1798 wrote the most extraordinary essay, which he called An Essay on Heat and the Combinations of Light, in which this teenager criticized, and he's not even 20 at this point, criticized the chemistry of Antoine Lavoisier, seen here in this magnificent portrait by David with Madame Lavoisier. And if you're in the New York area, it is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is a really huge picture, one has to say. One of Lavoisier's main theoretical claims was to get rid of phlogiston and replace it with what he called calorique or heat. Davy had phases of wanting to bring phlogiston back, but never sort of quite got there. Instead, he had a sort of halfway house, which he called phosoxygen, which he wanted to use to displace Lavoisier's calorique. And one does have to say that within a couple of years of this, Davy was repudiating these early youthful indiscretions in chemistry. This essay was sent by Giddy and via Gregory Watt to Thomas Beddoes in Bristol, a very radical position. Beddoes was so impressed with this that he offered Davy the job of superintendent of what he called the Medical Pneumatic Institution in Bristol, sight unseen. The problem was that Davy was an apprentice, and you just can't walk out of an apprenticeship. Newspapers of the time are full of adverts of masters requesting the return of runaway apprentices. And Bourlaise, the master, was sort of rather reluctant to give up Davy. And we do know that there was a dinner between Bourlaise and Giddy. And I would really love to know precisely what Giddy said to Bourlaise, because the following day, Bourlaise signed the Davy's indenture of apprenticeship with this text, freeing Davy from his apprenticeship. And the following day, Davy left Penzance and went to Bristol, which was then a 5-day journey. It's a bit better today, one has to say. At the Medical Pneumatic Institute in Bristol, Davy's job was to experiment with the gases that had been discovered in the 18th century by people like Priestley and so on, and to see if they had any physiological effect. And with nitrous oxide, he discovered it had an intense physiological effect, mostly pleasurable, sometimes not. And he inhaled in large quantities. I think 27 liters is the maximum I've caught him inhaling so far in a day. And he would do this day after day after day. And once, when he was clearly under the influence of 7 liters of nitrous oxide, he writes in 1-inch letters in his notebook, Davy and Newton. Notice the word order, since he seems to have believed, albeit under the influence, that he was going to do the chemistry in the early 19th century what Isaac Newton had done a century or so before. And in the Science History Institute here, there's a wonderful box which contains a manuscript by Newton on the left and a letter by Davy on the right. And I'm absolutely sure that Davy would have thoroughly enjoyed being in the same box as Newton. At Bristol, Davy also met the poets I mentioned earlier, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, and so on. And Davy was responsible for seeing through the press the lyrical ballads, second edition of the lyrical ballads by Wordsworth, that seminal text of English Romanticism, which has always given Davy a special place in the history of science and in the history of literature. The problem was that Davy needed to earn his money, his income by doing science. Beddoes was a well-known radical under government surveillance, and also, one has to say, persecution. And so Davy started looking for a new job, and in spring of 1801, he successfully became lecturer in chemistry at the recently founded Royal Institution in London. This is quite extraordinary. This is Davy moving from provincial radical Bristol to metropolitan aristocratic London. And Davy quickly changed his rhetoric in his lectures from a sort of slightly materialistic Republican vein to a much more aristocratic loyalist vein. And Davy, during the first decade of the 19th century, became became the most popular lecturer in London, illustrated by this Gilray cartoon showing Davy behind Thomas Garnett, who's professor of chemistry, administering laughing gas, nitrous oxide, to John Hippisley with slightly unfortunate consequences, one has to say. Now, the Royal Institution was an aristocratic organization, and Davy quickly aspired to join that aristocratic society at the various highest levels. And the other way he did this was by becoming professor of chemistry to the Board of Agriculture, about a 5-minute walk from the Royal Institution. Board of Agriculture was a sort of semi-official, semi-state organization, received a government grant of £3,000 a year, which is sort of quite a lot of money, and was also composed of aristocrats and very, very wealthy landowners. And Davy, apart from fishing, and Davy was a great fisherman, did nothing else than going to stay in large, stately homes. Petworth, home of Earl of Egremont on the sort of top left, Woburn, the Duke of Bedfordshire, and Holcombe, the Earl of Leicester in Norfolk. And Davy seems to have been quite happily accepted in that community. Davy's head was not entirely turned by this aristocratic lifestyle. He did do some chemical research at the RI. He built some of the largest batteries in the world at that point, with which in 1807 he identified and named chemical elements like sodium and potassium. Then in 1810 he met Jane, a priest, a very, very wealthy widow, and after a fairly short courtship, they married in 1812, and Davy was able to retire at the age of 33 from all his paid positions. She had an income of £4,000 a year and a capital of about £60,000. And when you think that Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice was very happy with Mr. Bingley having £5,000 a year, it gives you some idea of the sort of wealth we are dealing with. She was a widow. Her father had been a merchant on Antigua in the British West Indies, earning his money in a really disreputable way, to put it mildly. Her first husband died before he could inherit his baronetcy, so she wasn't going to make that mistake in her second marriage, and ensured that Davy was knighted by the Prince Regent 2 days before they got married, so that she immediately became Lady Davy, a title she retained for the rest of her life, despite being a widow for about 25 years. On their honeymoon tour of Scotland, they visited yet more large houses, and Davy seems to have written sort of just fairly inconsequential letters to his mother, saying where they were staying, just to sort of show how this sort of son of a bankrupt yeoman farmer had risen in the highly stratified world of Regency England. So this is a wonderful letter he writes to his mother from Dunrobin Castle in the far north of Scotland, the Scottish home of the Marquis of Stafford, one of the wealthiest men, if not the wealthiest man in England at that point. We shall stay here at the Marquis of Stafford for a fortnight longer. It is a most delightful family and a most delightful place. We shall then go to the Duke of Gordon's, from there to the Duke of Athol's, then to Lord Mansfield's Scone House, and then to Edinburgh. I mean, to get your saying with a marquis going to visit 2 dukes and then wind up with the other Mansfield is some sort of indication of social climbing. Continuing this sort of honeymoon theme, the following year, Davy, Lady Davy and his assistant Michael Faraday and Lady Davy's maid started on a tour of the continent, passing through France into Italy, and then back through Germany on the eve of Waterloo, because Davy thought it was probably not a good idea for a group of English tourists to be found when Napoleon was out for his 100 days. In Paris, again, continuing a theme of visiting large aristocratic houses, or royal houses in this particular case, Davy and Lady Davy visited the ex-Empress Josephine at Malmaison, and Lady Davy, clearly the ex-Empress Josephine took a shine to Lady Davy because she gave her some porcelain from the collection at Mel Mason. On their return to Britain, Davy went fishing in Scotland at Lord Somerville's house, and there he received a letter from the rector of Bishop Wearmouth asking Davy to try and find a way of lighting coal mines safely without causing explosions. And in a very intense period of research in the closing months of 1815, Davy, working with Faraday, developed in the basement laboratory of the Royal Institution, developed the gauze lamp, where basically the metal of the gauze absorbs heat, keeps the temperature down, and prevents an explosion, and light passes through the holes. A really, really important invention, as Davy knew full well, as he describes in a letter to John Hodgson just at the end, right at the end of 1815. When a candle or lamp is enclosed in a wire gauze cylinder and introduced into an explosive mixture, the mixed gas burns steadily with the wire gauze vessel. I can control this destructive element flame like a bird in the cage. And later on, after he'd been created a baronet, Davy used the flame in chains as his emblem on his coat of arms. I suppose if Davy's remembered for anything today, it is for this work on the lamp. It was a really simple device. One does wonder why nobody had thought of it before, although one does have to say that Davy's paper on this is one of his more coherent papers. Davy does tend to ramble in his writings, and one can't help feeling from time to time that Faraday had a major role to play in the drafting and indeed the work of this paper. Two of the drafts of the paper are actually in Faraday's hand, modified by Davy. And what it did was essentially allow a massive increase in coal production in the 19th century. It allowed miners to mine much more deeply into coal mines, which was very dangerous, than they could have done before. One of the consequences to Davy of this invention of the miner's lamp is that he came to believe in a rather naive way that if something works in a laboratory, it will therefore work in the outside world. And in this, he started to make serious mistakes in his career. The first one followed shortly afterwards, when he was commanded personally in an audience by the Prince Regent on the right to go to Herculaneum to chemically unroll the papyri that had been excavated there since the mid-18th century and transcribe the contents. The idea was that they hoped that they would find lost works of Aristotle or lost plays of Euripides, and there was huge disappointment year after year, even down to today, because this project is still continuing. In that there's an awful lot of early first century materialism, which has some interest, but certainly not as sort of gripping as a play of Euripides or a work of Aristotle or Plato would have been. And Davy sort of developed a method where he would dip these papyri in a bath of iodine, heat the iodine to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and then gently, in theory, unroll the papyri and read the text. This is one of those things that Davy tested in the laboratory in the Royal Institution that seemed to work. It didn't really work in practice, and there were many arguments between Davy and the authorities of the Archaeological Museum in Naples over precisely who owned the content of these papyri, who owned the papyri. And there was a sort of rather arrogant presumption in London that because the Royal Navy had twice restored the Bourbons to the throne of Naples, therefore the Prince Regent was entitled to sort of ride roughshod over the authorities in Naples over this. Davy, while not formally expelled from Naples as far as I can make out, did leave rapidly in 1820 and returned to London. There he was, fortunately, I suppose, from Davy's point of view, in time to become President of the Royal Society of London in succession to Joseph Banks's 42 years as president. Anybody succeeding 42, somebody who's held job for 42 years was going to have problems. Sensible people like William Hyde Wollaston, who was the interregnum president, simply said, "No, I'm not going to do it. You do it, Davy," which shows Wollaston's wisdom and Davy's impetuosity. And again, Davy simply by his strength of character thought he could deal with the problems. Well, he couldn't. The Royal Society of London was, indeed is, a faction-ridden organisation, and the job of the president is to keep those factions in some sort of order. And Davy failed pretty abysmally, one has to say, as president. Had a stroke and resigned in 1827 and went abroad, touring Europe for the remaining couple of years of his life, spending a lot of time in what is now Slovenia, fishing in the River Sava, seen here. And indeed, Davy's last book that was published while he was still alive was called Salmonia, and it's all about fly fishing and the sort of flies you use to catch fish. Davy died in Geneva in 1829. Although the marriage between Davy and Jane Priest survived, it wasn't a particularly happy marriage. Within about 2 years, people were commenting on the rather poor state of their relations, and in 1822, there were even discussions about a formal separation between them, which never happened, although one has to say, while Davy was being president of the Royal Society of London, Lady Davy was touring the continent for most of the time, allegedly for the sake of her health. Nevertheless, when she heard that Davy was ill, fatally ill, she left everything, left London, and travelled quickly to Geneva, where she was just in time actually, to spend the last few hours of Davy's life. And this Davy's grave, seen here, he had a really impressive civic funeral in Geneva, where he remains. And when she got back to London, she went for Francis Chantry, the great sculptor, to sculpt the plaque in Westminster Abbey that you can see bottom left. Davy's one of those people who, had he died younger, would have probably had a much better reputation than he does. Immediately following his death, somebody called John Ayrton Paris wrote the most extraordinary anti-biography, which is a really sarcastic hatchet job on Davy's life. And Davy's reputation is only just beginning, I think, to recover from that. Davy's studies have increased enormously over the last few years, mostly because, as I mentioned earlier, Davy, because of his connection with the Romantic poets, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Southey, etc., and his work as a chemist, it combined in one person, give him a really special position in the history of English culture and English Romanticism. So last year, 4 volumes of his letters were published, and this year, a group of us got a grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council to transcribe and make available online, freely available to everybody, Davy's notebooks. These are an invaluable source. There are about 75 of them, mostly in Royal Institution archives. There are a few in what's now called Crescent Kerno, which is basically the old Cornwall record office. And we're already beginning to find some really, really interesting things in the notebooks that haven't really been noticed before, because Davy's handwriting is not the easiest of handwritings. His letters are possibly not too bad, depending on his mood when he's writing, but his notebooks, which are written for himself, are another matter, and slowly but surely we're going through them. So just to give you one example of the value, there's a sort of argument being developed by people like Larry Principi of continuity from medieval alchemy through to modern chemistry. And Davy's a very interesting figure in that particular regard. Coleridge writes letters saying, "My dear alchemist," to Davy, which previously I think we just sort of took as a sort of figure of speech, but now we're taking it a lot more seriously as a sort of meaningful statement about how Davy was viewed, at least from outside the chemical world, as a chemist. And in one of the notebooks, we recently found the image of a phoenix, that sort of, which is an alchemical symbol. So I think as the sort of notebook project continues, and still got another 2 years or so to run, we will be able to find out a lot more about Davy. And I suspect very strongly that if I was to give this sort of talk 2 or 3 years hence, it will be really rather different. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating life, and what a fascinating brief tour through all of that. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Welcome.
So anyone out there, if you have questions for our speaker this evening, you can leave them in the chat here on YouTube, and I will pass them along. So we've already got our first question in the chat. So AJP writes, Davy dabbled in a lot of things. Was that unique to him or typical for a scientist at the time?
Well, first of all, he wasn't a scientist because that word wasn't coined until 1833. I always called him a chemist. Occasionally, one might just call him a natural philosopher. And he said he regarded himself as a chemical philosopher. The title of his major book on chemistry was called Elements of Chemical Philosophy, and that I think is how he viewed himself as a chemist. No, Davy wasn't particularly unusual. There were very few people practicing any form of science in late 18th, early 19th century England. When I was working on Faraday, I counted up the number of people paid for doing science in England, not in England, no, not just in England, but in the entire British Isles. And it came to, in 1812, and it came to just about 100. I mean, it's really very small number of people indeed. And a lot of the other thing to bear in mind about Davy is a lot of his work was commissioned. So his work on Herculaneum was commissioned by the Prince Regent. His work in the Royal Navy, which I didn't talk about, was commissioned by the Admiralty. His work on ventilating Newgate Prison was commissioned by the Home Office. So Davy was clearly the go-to person for anything which had a sort of scientific or technical requirement. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he covers quite a lot of ground. I have to say, I do think Davy's connection between science and poetry is not unique in the 19th century, but it is rare. One thinks later on in the 19th century, people like John Tyndall and James Clerk Maxwell, who both wrote poetry, and there are other far more obscure figures who did that.
I have a brief follow-up question to that, actually, on the topic of the rarity of being paid to conduct scientific inquiry. There is other work out there from other places, but in the same time period, from pharmacists. And I was very interested to hear that Davy had started out apprenticed as a pharmacist. I was wondering if he had not been able to get out of his apprenticeship, whether there would have been any possibility for him to really study or do any work in chemistry in that context, in that place and time.
Well, that's a tricky one, because I said we don't know the contents of Giddy's library, Tredear. Davy also had access to the library in Penzance, and again, we don't know precisely what happened, what he was able to read. The only time we know what Davy actually read was in Bristol, because the Bristol Library has kept a record of all the books that Davy withdrew. So that's a slightly tricky question to answer. I mean, my personal view is that Davy was such a charismatic character that I doubt if he would have remained an apothecary, a provincial apothecary in an obscure town in the far west of England. I mean, it is possible, but I somehow doubt that Davy's ego would have stood for it for long, actually.
And clearly, he had the skills to get himself to wherever he wanted to go.
Yeah, I mean, once Davy left Bristol, once Davy left Penzance, he clearly carefully planned his career. And I think one of the problems we all have with studying Davy is it's really hard to tell whether when Davy says something, he actually means it, or he's saying it in order to encourage people to sort of employ him. So the interview panel at the Royal Institution, for instance, was Joseph Banks, Henry Cavendish, and Count Mumford. And Banks loathed Beddoes. I mean, really loathed Beddoes. I mean, Banks is very, very rude to Georgina, Duchess of Devonshire, when she asks Banks to support Beddoes' project in Bristol. And I mean, Banks is curt to the point of rudeness to a Duchess, which is not the normal formal way you deal with a Duchess, particularly a Duchess of Devonshire. So one does wonder, at least I wonder, what did Davy say in that panel to convince them that he was politically sound? I mean, I've got no idea, but he must have said something, because Banks knew full well who he was and where he came from. And he convinced them. I mean, Davy's clearly good, very, very good at convincing people of his credentials. But as I say, it's very hard to tell whether he actually believed it or not. So there's a letter he writes to the Earl of Durham, whom Davy taught as a young boy in Bristol, and it's sort of talk about, it's in lamp controversy and all that sort of stuff. And there's a paragraph in it where he praises Lambton's political radical views, very radical views. I mean, Lambton had an income of sort of £40,000 a year, and so could afford to be radical and sort of tell the government what he thought of them. And Davy simply praises Lambton's sort of belief in democracy and public probity and so on. I just look at that. I think, you're just sort of telling Lambton what Lambton wants to hear.
So we have another question from the chat. Kat Long says, I'm surprised that Faraday and Davy were traveling around Europe in 1815. Was that after the Napoleonic Wars concluded?
No, it was during the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay.
That's something that's something which people have investigated, but a lot of the French archives were destroyed during the 39-45 war, particularly the records of the Prefecture of Police in Paris. Yes, it is absolutely extraordinary. Davy was awarded the Volta Prize of the Académie des Sciences in Paris, which had been a prize established by Napoleon personally, named after Volta, the inventor of the electric battery, to reward people who worked in electrical science. Davy, with his work on batteries and discovering sodium, potassium, and electrochemistry and so on, was a pretty obvious person to be awarded it, and he was awarded it. And the official reason why he went to Paris at that time was to formally receive the prize, which he did, but he only continued south into Italy. I mean, when Davy arrived in Paris, the British Army under Wellington was invading France across the Pyrenees. The Prussian and Russian armies under the command of the Tsar were about to invade France from the east. And indeed, just as the Davies were leaving Paris to head south, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, which opened the road to Paris, which was then occupied within about 4 months of that. One does have to say that Napoleon was genuinely interested in science. I mean, there's well-attested cases of him turning up at meetings of the Académie and asking intelligent questions and saying intelligent things. So one shouldn't just dismiss this as some kind of intellectual posturing, but as a general interest. So that may be why he gave the Davies this special passport to go across the channel. One does have to say the Governor Morlaix in Brittany was very, very surprised when they turned up in October 1813 with a passport allowing them to pass through France and go to Paris.
All right, we've got time for 2 more questions. We've got 2 more questions in the chat. So first up, Gary Patterson asks, what motivated Davy to oppose Faraday's election to the Royal Society?
How long have we got? Two reasons, I think. One psychological, in that Davy was becoming increasingly jealous of Faraday's undoubted abilities. Second, and probably decisive from Davy's point of view, is a political one, in that it happened very early on during Davy's presidency of the Royal Society of London. And one of the things Davy wanted to do was to make that society far more scientific than it actually was. I mean, it was full of people whose scientific credentials were weak, to say the least. And Davy wanted to sort of address that. I mean, this is one of the faction fights that I mentioned that he had. I mean, particularly with Royal Navy fellows who believed the Royal Navy should have a sort of considerable number of fellows, even though they weren't particularly interested in scientific matters, including exploration, one has to say. And if Davy had not publicly opposed Faraday's election, and what Davy did was simply walk around Somerset House with somebody saying in a very loud voice that Faraday should not be elected. Unless Davy had publicly opposed Faraday's election, everybody would assume that as Davy's protege, Faraday had Davy's support. So Davy had to make it very clear that Faraday did not have his support. It was a very, very unpleasant incident for everyone concerned. And Faraday said that after that, he and Davy's personal relationship basically collapsed, as you would expect in those sorts of circumstances. So I think there are those 2 reasons. I think operating together, they were absolutely lethal compound. But hello, right. Gary, by the way.
So last question comes from Fred Natus. Hopefully, for our last question, it doesn't expand past what we can hold in this space. He asks, can you say something more about Davy's romantic sensibility and his research interests and approach? How did those intersect?
I have a big problem with the term romantic. It does occur in the literature of the early 19th century, but not a lot, one has to say. It's one of those sort of things that you sort of define in terms of action. So you sort of say that people like Coleridge, Wordsworth, Southey, Davy were the early romantics, and people like Byron, Keats, Shelley were the sort of second generation of romantics. So you define it in that sort of way. And that's very tricky when you're dealing with Enlightenment, because Enlightenment sort of tended, and again, I've got problems with the term Enlightenment, but again, you've got there a sort of notion of collaboration, working in common communication. The Republic of Letters. I mean, I much prefer the term Republic of Letters, which existed from the late 17th century right the way through to the early 19th century, and then the war broke it up completely. So when somebody like Faraday came on the scene in the 1820s, he had to start a correspondence network from scratch. Thing about romantics is that if you look at the characteristics of those sort of people whom we call romantics, they're very, very self-centered. I mean, Davy is incredibly self-centered. I mean, the only thing that matters to Davy is Davy, and one can say that to a greater or lesser extent with the other people one's talking about. I mean, if you look at Shelley's time in Italy, I mean, the way he treats his wife and children, some of whom die because of Shelley's activities. I mean, it's really quite distasteful in modern terms, but presumably active. So you have that sort of switch over between that sort of collaborative, collective work that Beddoes really represents, and that individualistic approach that sort of Davy really represents. But then Davy, for some time, for 10 years, 11 years, worked in institutions, which by definition have to be collaborative. And it's only after he got married and had financial independence that he ceased to work in institutions, thinking he could do whatever he wanted to do. And that, certainly in the case of Royal Society of London, was not a particularly sensible strategy. And it is again very noticeable that everybody loves Davy, or most people love Davy, one or two exceptions, until he gets married. And then when he gets married, the comments, some of which are incredibly nasty, about Davy start circulating. So Davy is not paying as much attention to what his audience wants because he's independent financially. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I talked around it.
I think it does. I think it makes a lot of sense, actually, that his selection of research topics would change that much based on his circumstances, and maybe veering towards what he would have done otherwise if he hadn't been working in institutions. Yeah. All right. Well, that is our time for tonight. Thank you so much, Professor James, for joining us tonight, for coming to the Science History Institute, for giving this talk. This was fantastic. I hope that anybody out there will reach out with any more questions that they have. And just once again, thank you so much for joining us.
I mean, anybody can email me, sort of frank.james@ucl.ac.uk will find me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Have a good evening, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. For more from the Science History Institute, including information on all of our programs and events, you can always find us online. We are at scihistory.org on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you again next time.